we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on color. So the color wheel may be familiar. We're going to talk a little bit about it because we're going to spend some time today doing some blending and mixing. And this is actually really helpful to kind of look at when it comes to blending and mixing colors. So we'll kind of follow along with this today. So the supplies that I'll be using, I have a watercolor palette, a pan palette that already has pigment in it. And I'll also be using my watercolor palette that has the tubes of pigment. So if you have that too, if you created your own palette, I'll be using that too, so you can kind of follow along with whichever one you're doing. One of the things that I want to mention about this watercolor palette is that, with the tubes, I put a little bit in each of my trays here. You don't have to use a lot. If watercolor is something that you want to do a whole lot more of, then doing these tubes is a better route. It's more cost effective for sure. And these little tubes, even though they're tiny, that little bit goes a long way. So I've used these tubes over and over again, and I still have plenty in there. And so you can see that I put them in each of my trays. One of the things that I did, though, for this tray that I wanted to mention was on the back, I wrote down the name of the color. It's not absolutely necessary that you do that, but I have found it helpful because you start running into colors like these reds that I have here that are kind of similar. And when I get to the bottom and need to add more pigment, I need to know like which one was crimson, which one was brilliant red, which one was vermilion. Sometimes it's hard to tell which one was which. So that's when it's helpful to have it written on the back, which one is which, just for that refilling purposes. So I just wanted to kind of mention that too. Right. I'll also be using a few brushes today. I have a flat brush and a round brush that I'll be using, but I'll also be using paint brushes that came in the palette. So if you ordered a palette or have a palette, watercolor palette that comes with brushes, you will have one of these two brushes, a little flat one or a little round one. And so I'll be kind of demoing with all of them. So whichever one you have, you'll see we can do all of them. Okay. Also, we'll have 2 cups of water. We talked a little bit about the reason why. One is for clean water to add to your pigment, and one is to wash a brush. And I'll also be using a paper towel. So if you have, I've got a reusable paper towel that I'll be using, but you can also use like a cotton rag or an old t-shirt or just a regular paper towel. Any of those will work. And then of course, paper. I'll be using some regular watercolor paper today. I've torn it out of my watercolor paper pad. It's just a little easier for me to work with that way, but know that you can still paint on that pad with the paper attached as well. All right, so before we start anything, any painting, it's always good to activate our pigment. And so I'm just going to take a moment. When we activate our pigment, what we're doing is giving each of those pigments that we're going to be using a little water. We want that water to sit on there for a little while. As that water sits, it really kind of blends with the pigment, so we get a bolder, richer color. And so if you have your watercolor palette out and some like a spray bottle, go ahead and spray it. Know that you also don't have to have a spray bottle. If you have like a dropper or even just using your paintbrush to bring water to that palette, do that. All right. So we're going to let that sit for just a moment. Now, every palette is different. And so it is helpful before you start anything to kind of create a color swatch. We're going to spend some time with a color swatch today, kind of making our own for our palette. It really is helpful. Colors can look different when they're wet versus when they're dry. And so you may have seen, if you've watched like watercolor videos or things like that, you've seen people do little swatches that kind of look like this. Like I said, it's really helpful because you can see those colors in your palette when they're dry. And so it helps when it comes to mixing, and it helps when it comes to kind of planning what you're going to be doing. And so we're going to kind of create our own color swatch today. It's also important when you're doing a watercolor, like painting, to have a color swatch for each painting. And you want to make it sure that it's on that same paper because all paper is different. Some paper may be bright white. Some paper may be more of an off-white or a cream. Some paper may be a heavier, thicker paper. Even brands change too. And so it's good when you're doing a painting to make that color swatch on that same type of paper. The reason for that is when it comes to blending and mixing colors, you want to make sure if you use a certain color that you made, you want to be able to kind of color match if you have to make that color again, right? And so those color swatches are helpful in that way. So I'm just going to use this for our demos today, but know that you can use like paper that's still in your paper pad or just a loose paper. It doesn't have to be taped down for this process today. So what we're going to do, what we're going to start doing is creating a color swatch of our palette. So whether you have just a regular pan palette that has the pigment already in it, or you're creating your own out of the tubes, it's always good to kind of do these like color swatches. What I want to recommend doing is if you have your paper taped down like this, set up, you can do smaller pieces of paper like I had for the beginning, just little samplers, or you can do it on a big page. But what would be nice is to go ahead and mark all your colors down, do little squares of all those colors. So I'm going to start off by adding a little water to my cups. I'm doing 2 cups, again, just as a reminder, 1 cup of clean water that I add to my pigment, and then 1 cup to clean my brush. So what I want to encourage you to do right now, if you have your palette with you, go ahead and start making some color swatches. I'm going to get my brush nice and wet, and I'm going to start with my lighter colors. So if I'm doing my pan tray that came with the pigment in it, I've got my brush wet, I'm going to start with the yellow and just get that pigment on my brush and just really easily do a little mark. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like perfectly square. Just making a mark like that. And I'm going to clean my brush and then wipe it on my paper towel. Again, we have 1 water cup that helps clean the brush and 1 water for clean water to add to our palette. So what I'm going to do just real quickly, as I'm doing this, I'm going to make this yellow so I can reference back to it. And then I'm just going to go down my tray. My clean water, going to my next lighter color, making that mark. Ooh. And writing those colors down. One of the things that you'll notice is that your colors look different wet when they do dry. And so having the dry colors there, it really does help when you're painting. A color while it's wet may look darker, but as it dries, it lightens up, right? And so just kind of go through your palette, whether you're doing that pan palette or one you created, and just take some time to kind of mark those colors. And again, it doesn't have to be done a certain way. Just kind of take your time with it. And this is a good reference, like your whole time as you're using this palette. It's just great to have and keep with that palette, just so you can see those pigments. And one of the things you'll notice with mine here, I did one for my larger palette and then one for the pan palette. And you can see that there's a lot of similar colors, right? The dark green in my pan palette is very similar to the Viridian green that I've used tubes for. That bright red in my tube palette is very similar to the true red that's in the pan palette. There's a lot of overlapping in color. And so that's really helpful too. It helps you match color. It's just great to have that on hand. So just kind of take your time with that today. We're just going to go through and build that palette swatch. And it also kind of looks nice when it's finished too, taking that palette. So I'm just doing dark green. I'm just doing the pan palette that I have right here, but continue to kind of do that painting of your color swatches. I'm going to start talking about some other things, but definitely continue doing those color swatches. One of the things that I want to mention is as you're using your paintbrush, it's not always a good idea to leave your brush sitting in the water. You want to kind of clean your brush, get the water off, and then either lay it flat or put it somewhere where the bristles are upright. The longer it sits in the water, it affects the integrity of the brush. It kind of loosens those bristles, but it also kind of bends those bristles. And so you want to make sure you're either laying it flat or laying it upright so those bristles are facing up. Typically what I do when I'm doing the color swatch is I'll like spray it, activate it, and then not really add any more water. Watercolor is really transparent. You don't want that super dark pigment on there. So you want something that's kind of translucent, right? So even like just a little bit of water is fine. You'll find like if the more opaque it gets, you want to add water to it. But just kind of like what I have here, just kind of that watered down look, just what we sprayed, is good enough for this one. So I'm going to move this over for just a second. And definitely keep making those color swatches. But I want to talk about like color theory for a moment. Um, so you may be familiar with the color wheel. So let this be a little refresher. But I have found that it's worth it to kind of go back and reacquaint ourselves with the color wheel, especially when it comes to blending and mixing. So the color wheels are all generally set up the same way. We have our primary colors, which are the red, the yellow, and the blue. And so these are like the main colors that you don't blend other colors to make, right? These come red, yellow, blue. These are the colors that you mix to create all the other colors. So that red, yellow, and blue are those primary colors. Then we have these secondary colors, and the secondary colors are the orange, the green, and the violet, right? And so these are the colors that you mix equal parts of two primary colors. So equal part of red mixed with an equal part of yellow will give you orange. An equal part of yellow mixed with an equal part blue, a 1-to-1 ratio, will give you green. And an equal part of blue and equal part of red will give you that violet. And so you're mixing those primary colors to create those secondary colors. But then we have tertiary colors, and tertiary colors are made by mixing equal parts of one primary and one secondary color. So mixing equal parts of orange and red will give you that red orange. Equal parts of orange and yellow will give you that yellow orange. And so it is helpful to sit down and create a color wheel where you're kind of practicing that blending. And so here's an example here of the color wheel that I made. But what I did is I started off with my colors, right? My primary colors, that red, that yellow, and that blue, and then mix them together to get these other colors. There are a couple ways to mix colors that you'll find. And it's helpful, it really is helpful to kind of create a color wheel. Not that you're going to use your made color wheel in any of your watercolor painting, but it is helpful because it gives you that practice of mixing and blending colors. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of show a little bit of the blending and mixing. And so if you want to follow along, definitely do that. So I'm going to start off. I have a little plastic tray here I'm going to use for blending and mixing colors that I'm going to put on my paper. Right. If you have a pan, like a palette that you've added pigment to, generally they come with spaces for you to mix and blend color, right? If you have a tray that you get that already has the colors in it, that lid generally is separated into a couple sections. You can feel like the little separators in between them, and you can mix and blend on there. I'm going to use a palette here, so it's a little easier. But we're going to talk about making that color wheel and blending and mixing colors for it. Okay. So I'm just going to use, for this purpose, I'm going to use a round brush. And I'm going to start off by using just my regular red, yellow, and blue. That's what I'm going to use to make all my colors here, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my brush nice and wet. And I'm going to come over and I'm going to start with yellow. I'm just going to make a yellow. I'm going to do from my palette here, get my brush nice and covered in it. And I'm just going to do a mark with my yellow. Right? Make it on here. Clean my brush. And do my red. Or follow along, or just watch this part. Either is good. I'm going to add some blue. So I've got my primary colors here. Now this is the primary colors for like painting pigment like that. If you're doing like printmaking, your primary colors are a little different. If you're working with light, like TV, things like that, those primary colors are going to be different. But for painting, these are our three primary colors, that red, yellow, and blue. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mix equal parts of two of our primary colors to get that orange, purple, and green. And so what I'm going to do is get my brush wet again. And to make that green, I'm just going to grab some of my yellow. I'm going to start with my yellow. And put that yellow on my mixing tray. And then I'm going to come and get some of that red. Right? So I've got equal parts of the two. And I'm cleaning my brush in between each color. And then wetting my brush in between each color. And so to mix them together, I'll just kind of blend that in. And you can see I have this nice orange color that came from it. So I can put that in between the two. So I've made my orange. I'm keeping it on my palette instead of mixing it on my paper because I'm going to use that orange to make a tertiary color. So I have plenty of orange here. So my next step is to make that yellow and blue, make that green, mixing the yellow and blue. So I'm going to again do some yellow here in my brush. I'm going to add some blue. And again, we're wanting those equal parts. So we want the pigments to be about the same size, the same amount of water. I'm cleaning my brush, getting my brush wet, and then blending that together. Yes, so I see a question that's come up about does it need to be a particular red, blue, and yellow? Great question. So if you have your palette, like pan palette, it'll be easy to see which red, yellow, and blue to use. You don't have many options. But if you're using those colors that I suggested, right, in making your palette, you'll want to use, I'm using a crimson red as my red base. I'm using the aquamarine blue, and I'm using a lemon yellow. Those are the base colors that I'm using. If you have varying shades of blue, like if all you have is the cerulean blue, then definitely use that. And then when you're mixing colors, you'll know that your base blue is that cerulean blue. But it's worth it to keep track of which pigment you're using. And that's why it's helpful to have those colors written out on your tray somewhere as well. Great question. So I've made my green here, and I'm just going to go over and make my green mark. Sure. And I'm saving that green because I'm going to use that green to make some more colors. And so then I'm going to blend that red and that blue. So I'm going to get some of my red here. And again, we want to make sure we're doing equal parts of each color, each of those primary colors. And then we can blend them together. And this is going to make our purple. Whenever it comes to like color swatches, color wheel, color blending, it really is helpful if you're using your own palette that you're picking color, like tubes you're picking for. It's always helpful to label which yellow, which blue you're using. And you can see my purple is made now. So I can make that mark here. Okay. And so we have our primary, the red, yellow, and blue, and we have those secondary colors, that orange, green, and purple. So now what we're going to do is mix our secondary colors with those primary colors to get those tertiary colors. And again, just like we mix to make our secondary colors, we want equal parts. So what I'm going to do is mix the yellow with the orange that I have here, right? To make that yellow orange, right? So I'm going to take my brush, get some water on it, and get some of that yellow to mix. Okay. I'm doing a smaller amount than the orange because I'm going to use that orange a couple times, a few times, a couple times. Okay. And so after I put my yellow on there, I'm going to clean my brush again and get it wet. And then I'm going to mix those two. And again, we want equal parts. So I'm not using all of that orange. I'm going to use that orange for something else. But now I've got this kind of yellow orange that I've created and I can add here. And you can see it's kind of an in-between yellow and orange, right? It's that yellow orange. And so I'm going to use that orange again and mix it with a red. Okay. So I'm going to take my clean brush, bring that red in, clean my brush again, and then mix those colors. I'm not mixing where that yellow was, but I'm mixing that orange. And then I can make my palette color here. Okay. So one of the things that I want to mention too, as we're talking about blending and mixing for the color wheel here, is that when you have your pan palette like this, where the colors are already in there, they're not labeled, right? When we're putting the pigment in for the tubes, we know what colors those are because it says it on the tube. And so if you have a palette that looks like this, you're kind of guessing at your names, right? But it is helpful to kind of label those things, especially when it comes to colors that you're blending and mixing together, right? And so as you're just kind of going through blending and mixing and testing those colors, you're making this color wheel. It's also giving you practice on how to blend and mix, right? The more you do the blending and mixing of colors, the more used to, or the more familiar I'll get at adding how much water to add in. It is a little trial and error. I can show on my brush, like demo how to do it all day. I can watch videos on it all day. But the truth is, unless I take that brush and I try it out myself, I don't have that real understanding of how much water, how much pigment to use. And so I want to encourage you to kind of play with it a little bit, blending and mixing, maybe making a couple different color wheels just to get that practice. There are about 3 different ways to blend and mix color. One of them is on your palette, like what I'm doing here. I prefer this way because it gives me extra colors, right? If you're mixing it in other ways, you're using that color up that you've made. But when you do it on the palette, you have those colors you can use again and again. So this is my favorite way to blend colors, mix colors. And it's basically wet on wet, using a wet brush, with wet pigment, and a wet surface. Okay? And so it's that kind of wet on wet process. The next way to do it is by actually mixing it on your paper. And so I'll show how to do that with these two colors here, so you can see. So mixing it on your paper is taking, I'm going to get my brush wet, is taking your pigment that you blended. I'm using this purple here. And so I'm just going to get a little purple on my brush. And I'm going to go ahead and put that purple on my paper. So it's wet, right? I'm going to clean my brush, give my brush a little wet, and then I'm going to come and get red on my paintbrush. Not too much, but get red on my paintbrush. And then I'm going to take that red and mix it with that purple right there on the paper. Okay, so that's another way to mix your colors. It's a little harder to do, I think, sometimes because it's hard to get the equal parts in there because you're wanting the equal parts of the purple and the equal parts of the red. And so it's a little harder to see. But if you only need a small amount of a color for one purpose, this is a great way to blend. Right? So I'm going to clean my brush again and get it wet. Another way to blend color is by doing glazes. Glazes here are where you take like your pigment. So I'm going to take that purple again, and I'm going to just kind of paint it here. Paint that purple here and let it start to dry. And you can see as this other purple that I painted, it's dry now. And you can see it's kind of, well, mostly dry. Letting that pigment get on there. Once this purple dries, I'm going to take my blue and paint it on top. So it's kind of layering that pigment. This is also like a great way. I'm sure there are times where you can use this kind of glazing in a painting process. This is that third way. Once this dries, I'll add the blue and you'll be able to see kind of the glaze. Basically what glazing is it's layering your pigment, right? And so what we're doing here is we're layering that purple and that blue. So I have that purple layer down. I'm letting that dry completely. Once it dries, I can come back with that blue and do a layer on top. It's a little harder this way, again, to do equal parts that way. So it's not the best way to use for like making a color wheel, but a lot of times it works really great when you're doing other paintings, like different types of painting. But I'm showing it here just so we can see the different ways to blend and mix color for sure. I'm going to go ahead and mix that green and blue. So I'm going to get my brush clean, do some equal parts blue here. Mix that green and blue, and then make that color swatch. Do the same with that yellow and green. One of the great things about mixing on a palette like this is that when that water evaporates and those colors dry, that pigment still stays there. So you can use these colors again just by getting water on your brush and activating it that way. Right? A lot of times, I'll just kind of leave the pigment on there because especially if I'm doing a painting, I'll come back to these same colors that I'm using. If you are done and you don't need these colors anymore, you can wipe them off. Sometimes I'll use my reusable paper towel or just a regular paper towel to kind of wipe it up and wash it in the sink to clean it up. You can see with this one that my paint tray is stained quite a bit because I've used it for quite a while. And so you may notice if you have a white or a clear tray that you're working on, that it'll kind of get tinted the more you use it. And that's okay. If you're just like using in between different colors, you just want to make sure you're wiping that off for sure. So that's kind of how to clean our tray. When your colors start bleeding, then it's kind of hard to get that color out. Once it starts blending together, it's hard to unblend it. And so the best thing to do is kind of start over again with the blending and mixing. I know that's not the best the best question, the easiest route, but a silver lining, it gives us more practice in blending and mixing color. One of the things you can do also is I have just one like open space that I'm working on today, but you can also do different types of paint trays, like one like this one I got from the Dollar Tree. It came in like a set of 3, I think, but it has different sections and you can blend and mix where it's separated like this. I'll say one that I use all the time is a tray that's separated like this. And so these are colors that I use a lot, and I'm constantly making those colors. So you can see they're dry on there. They're not coming off. But if I want to use this color, I can just take my brush. Let's say I want to use this orange. Just painting a rain. I want to use like this yellow orange I have here. So I'll just get my brush wet and then start mixing that color again. And it's activating that color. So now I can use that. I think that's the great thing about watercolor is that it dries and you can use it again, the blending and mixing. If you're doing acrylic paint or like even oil paint, you have to make sure you have, you put it in a container with an airtight lid so it lasts longer. A lot of times with acrylic paint, you can add a little water to it to help reactivate it. But with watercolor, you don't have to worry about sealing it or putting it in a special container. Once it dries, that pigment is still there and it's not going to move until you add some more water to it. So it's good having those extra trays that have sections that help prevent that bleeding and mixing for sure. It's really helpful when we look at our color wheel. It's really helpful to know that color wheel, to be familiar with the color wheel when it comes to shadows and light. I want to point out, like on here, there's I have examples of warm colors, cool colors, analogous colors, complementary colors, just so we can kind of see it laid out there. And I'm sure, like I know this is a reminder for everyone, but what I want to focus on is the complementary colors. And so, as I said, this is really helpful when it comes to creating things like shadow or light. Let's say I'm wanting to draw a lemon, right? We know a lemon is yellow. So I'm just going to do my little lemon here, right? My simple lemon. To get shadow in my lemon, what I'll do is I'll start off with that complementary color. So if we look at our color wheel, here, we know the complementary color for yellow, it's right across from it. The complementary colors are right across from each other. So the complementary color for yellow is going to be purple. So when I do my shadow, I'm going to take that purple and get my brush wet. I'm going to take the purple, and I'm going to use my pan tray here, but I'm going to take the purple and just kind of paint that shadow where I'm doing the shadow. Okay. So my lemon, I know when we look at a lemon, there's no like purple in the lemon. You don't see purple at all. You see varying shades of yellow, right? You see a true yellow, you see maybe a yellow green or a yellow brown or, ochre or something like that. You see all these different shades, different tones, values of yellow. But when we use that complementary color to create the shadow, it really does help. Complementary colors are wonderful because they make the other colors more vibrant and jump out. We can see different artists throughout history who used complementary colors. And I think Van Gogh is like the first one that comes to our mind. He used complementary colors. He was a master of using complementary colors to make his paintings look bright and vibrant. He used a lot of blues and like oranges, yellows to really pop, right? And so that complementary color is going to give us that really nice natural looking shadow. You may notice as you are kind of observing things around you, noticing color around you, you may notice that when you look at shadows, that there's really no black in shadows. And I want to encourage you this week to kind of notice that as you go through your week. Maybe practice making some color wheels or blending and mixing colors. Also notice shadows. Shadows are a reflection of light, right? And so what you're going to see in the shadow is a variety of color. Rarely ever do I use black in any of my palettes. I rarely ever use gray unless I'm doing like fine line detail stuff. When I'm mixing colors and doing a painting, I rarely ever use black. I use this technique of like complementary colors to help make that shadow, that natural looking shadow. So what I'm going to do is to make my lemon, I'm going to start adding that yellow to it now. So I'm going to get my brush wet. Need to add more water to my yellow. I'm going to get my brush covered in that yellow. I'm just going to paint that yellow. And so I've painted this lemon. I used that purple, that complementary color, to make that shadow, and then painted over it with the yellow. And so now we have a more natural looking shadow. We didn't have to use black or dark browns or grays to bring that shadow in, right? Just using that purple. When I'm doing something like this, it is helpful to kind of do that shadow first and let it dry. You don't have to do it that way. You can do it the other way, like where you're doing that main color first and then gradually adding that darker color in. That's a great way to work. I will say if I'm working on like the cast shadow that comes off of like the lemon, let's say my lemon is standing up and I need a cast shadow here. I'm not going to start doing that shadow part. I am going to start with those lighter colors. It's just helpful for this demo and just in general, this is kind of the way I do shadows. What I can do also is like if this is a true shadow, we're thinking about where the light is coming in and hitting it, right? There's going to be a part down here that's going to be a darker shadow, right? So what I can do is go back to my purple, right? And add an even darker shadow there, right? Layer that up. So you can kind of see that shadow, more of that shadow, right? Just like when it comes to drawing, it's helpful to know where the light is coming from when we're drawing something that's representational, like a lemon or a landscape. It's helpful to know where that light is coming from. That's going to help us with our color choices when it comes to actual painting. And so I have an example that I painted earlier. You can see like for a lemon, I used a violet and a lemon yellow to create that. That violet gave me that natural looking shadow. For leaves, I do the complementary color of green. So I used a sap green for my main color, but I used that crimson as that shadow. And I did the opposite for the apple. So you can see like those complementary colors give you more of a natural shadow. So it's helpful to understand how to like, first of all, remember the complementary colors, remember our color wheel, but it's helpful when it comes to blending and mixing as well. So that's kind of blending and mixing. One of the things that I really enjoy about watercolor is that it's not a fast process. It really is a slow, slow process. You have to slow down because you're waiting on the paint to dry, right? Or waiting for that water to be evaporated before you can put another layer on. And so I do want to say thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask, or email us at our contact@Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.